A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some footage of the production lines in Haifa the other day, and it struck me how much our mental image of defense manufacturing is stuck in the 1940s. We think of steel mills, massive foundries, and soot-covered workers hammering out tank hulls. But the modern Israeli interceptor plant looks more like a high-end clean room for surgical equipment or a semiconductor fabrication lab. It is quiet, it is clinical, and it is incredibly fragile in ways people do not realize. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the philosophy of military non-dependence and the reality of domestic defense production in Israel. It is a topic that feels especially heavy given the production surges we have seen throughout the start of 26. We are seeing these facilities running at 300% capacity, and it raises a fundamental question. Can a small nation ever truly be independent when its survival depends on the most complex supply chains on the planet?
Herman Poppleberry here. Daniel is hitting on a fundamental tension that defines the entire Israeli economic experiment. There is this popular myth of the Iron Dome as a symbol of total national self-sufficiency, a shield forged entirely from local grit and genius. You see it in the posters and the recruitment videos, the idea that Israel stands alone, protected by its own ingenuity. But if you peel back the casing of a Tamir interceptor, you find a global map of dependencies that would make a logistics manager have a panic attack. The goal of military non-dependence, or MND as the policy circles call it, is not actually about making every single screw and circuit board in-house. That is a physical impossibility in 2026. Instead, it is about strategic leverage and the ability to maintain operational freedom when the rest of the world decides to look away. It is about making sure that if the taps are turned off elsewhere, you have enough in the tank and enough know-how in the room to keep the lights on and the interceptors flying.
You mentioned the myth of self-sufficiency, and I think that is where we have to start. Because if you look at the history, the drive for autonomy was not a choice made from a position of strength or a desire for isolation. It was a desperate response to being abandoned by those who were supposed to be allies. You have talked about the 1967 French arms embargo before, and it seems like that is the trauma that still dictates every decision made at the Ministry of Defense today. It is the ghost in the machine of the Israeli industrial base.
The 67 embargo is the original sin of Israeli procurement history. Before that, France was the primary supplier. They provided the Mystère and Mirage jets that were the backbone of the Air Force. When Charles de Gaulle cut off the supply of jets and spare parts right before the Six-Day War, it sent a shockwave through the establishment that never really dissipated. It was a betrayal that redefined the national psyche. The lesson they learned was that a sovereign nation that cannot arm itself is not truly sovereign. It is merely a tenant of its suppliers. That led directly to the development of the Nesher and the Kfir fighter jets, which were basically modified, Mirages built through a mix of domestic engineering and, let's be honest, some very effective industrial espionage. But the pinnacle of this era was the Lavi project in the 1980s. The Lavi was supposed to be the ultimate statement of independence, a top-tier multi-role fighter built entirely in Israel, designed for the specific needs of the Middle Eastern theater.
But the Lavi was cancelled. And that cancellation is often framed as a national failure, a moment where Israel had to bow to American pressure and economic reality. But you have argued it was actually the catalyst for the modern tech sector. How does a failed fighter jet program lead to a world-leading defense industry and the Silicon Wadi?
It was a failure of the platform, but a massive success for the ecosystem. When the Lavi was scrapped in 1987 due to astronomical costs and American pressure, the U.S. didn't want a subsidized competitor to the F-16. You suddenly had thousands of the world's most talented aerospace software and materials engineers looking for work. They did not just go get jobs at banks or move abroad in a mass brain drain. They stayed, and they founded the startups that became the backbone of the Israeli high-tech miracle. They took the flight control logic, the radar processing algorithms, and the advanced composites research they had developed for the Lavi and applied them to missiles, drones, and eventually civilian tech. The lobby died so that the Israeli high-tech industry could live. It shifted the focus from building the big iron, the heavy platforms like tanks and jets, to focusing on the brains of the systems. Israel realized it couldn't outproduce the US or Russia in terms of sheer mass, but it could outthink them in terms of precision and integration.
So, the policy of non-dependence shifted from trying to build the whole car to owning the engine and the software. But let's look at the economic structure of this. We are talking about state-owned giants like Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries, plus the publicly traded but deeply connected Elbit Systems. These are not your typical sluggish government bureaucracies. They are some of the most profitable and innovative companies in the country. How does Israel manage to keep state-owned enterprises so lean and competitive when most countries struggle with the bloated defense contractor syndrome?
It is a unique hybrid model that defies standard economic theory. Raphael and AI, are technically government-owned, but they operate with a high degree of corporate autonomy. They have to compete on the global stage for contracts. In 2024, Israeli defense exports hit a record $13.1 billion. You do not hit those numbers by being a bloated civil service department. They are required to return a profit to the state, but more importantly, they serve as national laboratories. The research and development cycles are not just driven by market demand, but by immediate operational requirements from the front lines. The feedback loop between the soldier in the field and the engineer at the bench is measured in weeks, not years. If a new drone threat appears on the northern border on a Tuesday, the engineers at Rafael are working on a software patch by Wednesday. That proximity to the end user creates a level of urgency that you just don't find at a massive firm in Virginia or Toulouse.
That feedback loop is a huge competitive advantage, but it also creates a weird labor market distortion, doesn't it? If the smartest engineers are all being funneled into defense R&D because of the prestige, the high salaries, and the national mission, does that starve the civilian sector? Or is the dual-use argument actually valid, that military tech eventually becomes civilian gold?
The dual-use argument is the entire engine of the economy. Think about the signal processing required for an Iron Dome interceptor to distinguish between a harmless piece of debris and a high-speed rocket in a cluttered sky. That same math is what powers advanced medical imaging or the sensors in autonomous driving. The labor market does get tight, and the salaries in the defense sector have to stay competitive with the big multinationals like Google or Microsoft who have R&D centers in Tel Aviv. But the defense companies offer something those firms cannot, which is the chance to work on systems that are literally a matter of national survival. That mission-driven focus keeps the talent from leaking away entirely. However, there is a cost. When you have a security-first industrial policy, you are essentially placing a security tax on your human capital. The engineer working on a fragmentation warhead is an engineer who isn't working on climate tech or education software.
Let's get into the technical reality of Daniel's prompt, specifically the 24/7 manufacturing of interceptors. We have seen the demand for Tamir and Arrow missiles skyrocket over the last 2 years, especially with the regional escalations we've seen in late 25 and early 26. When you are running a factory at 300% capacity for months on end, where does the non-dependence philosophy hit a wall? You can't just wish more raw materials into existence, no matter how patriotic your workforce is.
This is where the total autonomy narrative falls apart and the hidden dependency reveals itself. A single Tamer interceptor has over 1,000 unique components. While the design is Israeli and the final assembly happens in places like the Rafael facilities in the north, about 15% of those components are sourced from non-domestic Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers. We are talking about specialized microchips from Taiwan, high-grade carbon fiber from Japan, or specific chemical precursors for the solid rocket motors that might come from the United States or Europe. For example, the high-energy polymers used in the propellant, things like hydroxyl-terminated polybutadiene, are not produced in sufficient quantities domestically. You are dependent on a global chemical supply chain that is surprisingly fragile.
So if a supplier in, say, the Netherlands or the UK, decides to halt exports of a specific valve, a sensor housing, or a chemical stabilizer because of political pressure or a change in government, the entire production line for a multi-million-dollar defense system can grind to a halt. That seems like a massive vulnerability for a country that prides itself on independence.
It is a massive vulnerability, and it is one the Ministry of Defense spends a lot of time worrying about. The Israeli strategy to mitigate this is twofold. First, they maintain massive strategic stockpiles of these long lead time components. They don't just buy what they need for the month, they buy years' worth of sensors and chips in advance. They treat microchips like grain in a silo. Second, they have a policy of design for substitutability. When they design a system, they try to ensure that if one foreign component becomes unavailable, they can pivot to a different supplier or bring that specific manufacturing process in-house relatively quickly. But relatively quickly in aerospace still means months. In a high-intensity conflict where you are firing dozens of interceptors a day, you do not have months, you have hours. This is why the surge capacity is so hard to maintain. You can't just hire more people. You need the physical parts to be sitting in a warehouse ready to go.
Which brings us to the United States. We cannot talk about Israeli military non-dependence without talking about the massive dependency on Washington. Not just the $3.8 billion in annual military aid, but the joint production agreements. The Iron Dome is now partially manufactured in the United States through the Raytheon-Rafael joint venture in Arkansas. Is this a strategic move by Israel to ensure American buy-in, or is it a sign that they simply cannot meet the production demands on their own?
It is a calculated trade-off. By moving some production to the United States, Israel secures the American supply chain and ensures that the U.S. has a vested interest in the success and funding of the program. It makes the Iron Dome an American-Israeli success story rather than just an Israeli one. It also allows Israel to use foreign military financing, or FMF, funds to buy the interceptors. Under the current 10-year Memorandum of Understanding, Israel is required to spend an increasing percentage of that aid in the United States rather than on its own domestic industry. This is a huge point of friction. The Israeli defense firms hate it because it feels like they are being forced to outsource their own genius to American factories to satisfy a budget requirement. It weakens the local industrial base in the long run, even as it provides a short-term logistical umbrella.
It sounds like a guns versus butter trade-off, but with a twist. It is domestic guns versus American sourced guns. If Israel is forced to spend more of its defense budget in the US, it weakens the local factories in Haifa and Yavna. But if it tries to go entirely independent, it loses the diplomatic and logistical support of the world's only superpower.
That is the tightrope. And we saw this play out with the Aero 3 system. It was a joint project, heavily funded by the US, but when Germany wanted to buy the system in 2023 for nearly $4 billion, the US had to give the final approval for the sale. Israel owns the intellectual property, but the US holds the keys to the export market. This export or die cycle is critical. Because the Israeli domestic market is too small to sustain these massive companies, they have to sell to India, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, just to keep the production lines warm during peacetime. If you aren't exporting, your unit costs skyrocket, and you can't afford to keep the engineers on staff.
And if those production lines aren't warm, you can't surge when a war starts. I want to go deeper on the actual shop floor reality of that surge Daniel mentioned. People imagine that you just hire more workers and turn on the lights for the night shift, but these are highly specialized roles. You can't just take a person off the street and teach them how to calibrate a seeker head for a hypersonic interceptor in a week. What does that human capital bottleneck look like in 2026?
The human capital bottleneck is actually more significant than the material one. You are dealing with technicians who need high-level security clearances and years of specific training on proprietary systems. During the recent surges, we have seen these companies pull in retirees back onto the floor. 70-year-old master technicians who are the only ones who know how to hand solder a specific connection. They are shifting engineers from R&D roles into production oversight. It is an all-hands-on-deck environment that is sustainable for a few months, but it leads to massive burnout. And because these facilities are often located in areas targeted by rocket fire themselves, you have the added complexity of running a high-precision manufacturing process while the air raid sirens are going off. Imagine trying to calibrate a laser-guided system while the building is literally shaking from an explosion 2 miles away.
It is an incredible psychological burden. Imagine being the person responsible for the final quality control check on an interceptor that might be protecting your own neighborhood 2 hours after it leaves the factory. The stakes of a manufacturing defect are not a product recall, they are a direct hit on a civilian center. But let's look at the hidden dependency again. You mentioned chemical propellants. That seems like a very old world industrial problem for a new world tech country. Why hasn't Israel solved the propellant issue?
Because chemistry doesn't care about your software prowess. Solid rocket motors require very specific polymers and oxidizers, like ammonium perchlorate. The global supply chain for high-energy chemicals is surprisingly small and highly regulated. If there is a fire in a single chemical plant in the Midwestern United States or a strike at a facility in France, it can create a multi-year backlog for every missile program in the West. Israel has invested heavily in domestic chemical production through companies like Tomer, which is the state-owned firm responsible for rocket motors, but they still rely on imported raw materials. You can't be 24/7 if you're waiting on a tanker that's being diverted around the Cape of Good Hope because of maritime insecurity. It shows that even the most high-tech nation is still tethered to the low-tech reality of bulk commodities.
So the non-dependence is really more about resilient dependency. It is about making sure that no single point of failure can topple the whole system. But what about the economics? We have mentioned the record exports, but how much of that is actually profit for the state versus a subsidized jobs program? Because if the state is the primary customer and the state owns the company, the accounting can get a little circular. Is the defense industry actually a net gain for the Israeli taxpayer?
It is less circular than you might think. These companies are major contributors to the national treasury through dividends and taxes. But more importantly, the domestic defense industry acts as a massive hedge against the cost of war. If Israel had to buy every interceptor from a foreign supplier at market rates during a conflict, the currency would collapse under the pressure of capital flight. By producing domestically, they keep that money within the local economy. It is a Keynesian stimulus package that also happens to shoot down missiles. The real cost is the opportunity cost, the guns versus butter tension we discussed in episode 548. The engineers who aren't building the next green energy breakthrough because they are refining a fragmentation warhead represent a lost future.
I want to push back on the efficiency of these state-owned giants. We have seen in other countries that without the threat of bankruptcy, these firms can become stagnant, bloated, and resistant to change. Is there a risk that by making Raphael and AI too big to fail, Israel is creating a defensive bubble that will eventually pop?
The competition is the safeguard. Even though they are state-owned, they compete against each other with a ferocity that would shock a private sector CEO. Raphael, IAI, and Elbit often bid for the same Ministry of Defense contracts. The MOD is a very demanding and very unsentimental customer. If Elbit can produce a drone that is 10% cheaper and 5% better than the IAI version, Elbit gets the contract, and the IAI division responsible for that drone has to pivot or face internal restructuring. This internal competition, combined with the need to win export deals against global titans like Lockheed Martin or BAE Systems, keeps them incredibly sharp. They cannot afford to be sluggish because the customer in this case is a soldier whose life depends on the gear working perfectly the first time. There is no beta testing in a missile defense engagement.
Let's talk about the future of this model. We are seeing a shift toward AI-driven manufacturing and autonomous production. Can Israel use its lead in software to solve the human capital bottleneck? Could we see a future where interceptors are being printed and assembled by autonomous systems with minimal human intervention, finally achieving that dream of total independence?
We are already seeing the beginnings of that. There is a huge push toward Industry 4.0 in the defense sector. Automated optical inspection, robotic arms for precision soldering, and AI-driven supply chain forecasting are all being integrated into the Haifa and Tel Aviv plants. The goal is to reduce the number of touch points where a human can make a mistake or where a labor shortage can slow things down. But there are certain things, like the handling of energetic materials or the final integration of sensitive optics, that still require the human hand and eye. The sovereign factory of the future is one where the software is as much a part of the defense as the hardware.
It feels like the definition of non-dependence is evolving. In 1967, it meant having a warehouse full of spare parts. In 2026, it means having the sovereign capability to update the software on 1,000 missiles simultaneously to counter a new electronic warfare threat. The independence is in the code, not just the steel.
That is exactly the shift. If you buy a weapons system from a foreign power today, you aren't just buying a machine, you're buying a black box. You don't have access to the source code. You can't tweak the algorithms. If the supplier decides they don't like how you're using the weapon, they can just stop sending the software updates or even remotely disable the systems through built-in kill switches. True non-dependence in the 21st century means digital sovereignty. It means knowing exactly what is happening inside the processor of every missile you fire. This is why Israel is pushing so hard for domestic chip design. Even if the chips are fabricated in a foundry in Arizona or Taiwan, having the blue and white design, the Israeli-owned architecture is the ultimate insurance policy.
But I wonder about the political cost of this pursuit of autonomy. Does the drive for military non-dependence actually make Israel more isolated? If you don't need anyone else's help to defend yourself, do you stop caring about what the rest of the world thinks? Does strategic depth lead to diplomatic isolation?
It is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gives you the ability to make decisions based on your own national interest rather than the whims of a foreign capital. You aren't checking your watch to see if Washington or Brussels is going to cut off your supply of interceptors before you make a move. On the other hand, military cooperation is a form of diplomatic glue. When you co-develop a system like David's sling with the Americans, you are weaving your destinies together. Total independence is a lonely and dangerous place to be for a small country. The smartest strategy is interdependence by choice. You want to be so integrated into the global defense web that people can't afford to cut you off, but so capable domestically that you can survive if they try.
It is like a high-stakes game of poker, where you are also the person who manufactured the cards. You want everyone to keep playing, but you need to know exactly how the deck was printed. I think about the workers in those factories Daniel mentioned, the ones running the 24/7 shifts. There is a unique kind of industrial patriotism there. It is not just a job, it is a defensive position.
I have talked to some of the engineers at Rafael, and they describe the atmosphere during a conflict as being like a mission control center. They are watching the performance of the systems they just built in real time on the news. If they see an interceptor miss or a new type of threat emerge, they are literally rewriting the code on the production line for the next batch. That level of integration between manufacturing and the battlefield is something no other country has achieved at this scale. It is the ultimate expression of the startup nation philosophy applied to the grimmest possible reality.
But let's look at the limits. We talked about the 13.1 billion in exports. Over 35% of that is UAVs and air defense. That is a lot of eggs in one basket. If the world moves toward laser defense, like the Iron Beam system that is currently being deployed in 2026, what happens to the massive industrial base built around kinetic interceptors? Does a policy of non-dependence risk locking you into yesterday's technology because you have invested so much in the factories?
That is the sunk cost trap, and it is a real danger. If you have 5,000 people whose jobs depend on building solid rocket motors, you might be tempted to keep building them even when lasers become the more efficient option. However, the Israeli model seems to be avoiding this by having the same companies develop the successor technologies. Rafael is building both the Iron Dome and the Iron Beam. They are effectively cannibalizing their own market because they know if they don't do it, someone else will. The non-dependence philosophy applies to the future too. You have to be independent of your own past successes.
It is a brutal way to run an economy, but it is effective. The export or die mandate actually helps here, because the global market will tell you very quickly when your tech is becoming obsolete. If India or Finland stops buying your kinetic interceptors because they want lasers, you have to pivot or go bust. The global market acts as a reality check for the domestic defense bubble.
And that brings us back to Daniel's point about the operational reality. The 24/7 manufacturing is not just about volume, it is about iterative improvement. Every week of production is an opportunity to tweak the design based on what happened in the sky the week before. In a traditional defense procurement model, like the one used by the US Pentagon, you might lock in a design for a decade. In the Israeli model, the version of the interceptor rolling off the line in March of 2026 is likely different from the one that was being built in October of 2024. It is a continuous evolution.
It is agile manufacturing in a very literal sense. But what about the butter side of the equation? We are in 2026, and the cost of maintaining this massive defense industrial base is only going up. At what point does the security-first policy start to erode the very society it is supposed to protect? If you are spending so much on aero missiles that your schools and hospitals are crumbling, have you really won?
This is the central debate in Israeli politics. The argument from the defense side is that without the security, there is no economy. You can't have a thriving tech sector if people are spending half their time in bomb shelters. The defense industry is seen as the insurance premium for the rest of the nation. But you're right, the premium is getting incredibly expensive. The hope is that the technological spin-offs and the export revenues offset that cost, but it is a delicate balance. If the defense sector becomes a state within a state, it can start to drain the life out of the civilian economy.
It is also worth noting that this model relies on a very specific type of social contract. It relies on the idea that the entire population is invested in the defense mission. But as Israeli society becomes more fragmented, does that contract hold? If large segments of the population are not serving in the military or working in these industries, does the national laboratory model still work?
That is the human capital crisis that keeps the CEOs of these companies up at night. They need a constant stream of highly educated, highly motivated young people. If the education system fails, or if the social cohesion breaks down, the entire non-dependence edifice collapses. You can have the best factories in the world, but if you don't have the engineers to run them, they're just expensive piles of scrap metal. The defense industrial base is fundamentally a reflection of the national will.
So, to summarize the philosophy, it is not about isolationism. It is about strategic optionality. It is about ensuring that at the moment of maximum danger, you are the one holding the remote control. The limits are physical raw materials and specialized components, and they are human, the talent pool and the social contract. But as long as the Silicon Wadi and the front line remain connected, the model seems to endure.
It is a model born of trauma, sustained by competition and validated by operational success. But it is also a warning. It shows that in the modern world, independence is a relative term. You are always dependent on someone, a supplier, a customer, an ally. The goal of the Israeli policy is simply to choose your dependencies wisely and to ensure that you are always providing as much value to the world as you are taking from it. That $13.1 billion in exports isn't just revenue. It's a global network of people who now have a vested interest in the survival of the Israeli defense ecosystem.
It is defense by integration. And I think that is a perfect place to start wrapping this up. We have looked at the history, the economics, the shop floor reality, and the digital future of this non-dependence policy. It is a fascinating, high-stakes experiment that is being tested every single day in 2026.
If you want to dive deeper into the specific logistics of how these systems are funded and the unit economics of missile defense, I really recommend checking out episode 744, The Billion-Dollar Math of Missile Defense Logistics. We go into the gritty details of what it actually costs to shoot down a $300 drone with a $50,000 interceptor.
And if the macroeconomic side of this guns versus butter debate is more your thing, episode 548 is the one for you. It is a conversation that is only becoming more relevant as the defense budgets continue to swell globally.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to process these deep dives into global industrial policy.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these discussions valuable, a quick review on your favorite podcast app goes a long way in helping us reach more curious minds.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel.
Until then, keep asking the weird questions.
Catch you later.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth.